I'm Ayelet Waldman.
I'm Paul Waldman.
This is Boundary Issues.
Welcome to Boundary Issues, the podcast where two siblings solve all the world's problems while blaming each other for their own. We are going to have a terrific show today. Our guest today is Talia Lavin. She is a writer whose new book, which we are going to talk about, is called Wild Faith: How the Christian Right is Taking Over America. And it is a fascinating book and beautifully written, and brings up all kinds of issues that I know make Ayelet kind of crazy. But we are going to get into those. So, Talia, welcome to the show.
Talia, before you start talking, let me just say I was on a plane flying from the East Coast to the West Coast in the middle seat and reading your book cover to cover through the whole flight. And I am so fucking scared. I'm like looking around, looking for, first of all, there's your first book about the white nationalists and the incels. And I'm like, incel, white nationalists. And it's like, oh, crazy Christian, crazy. So my level of paranoia now is so through the roof. And I feel like I want to stand outside and scream, do you people not know what's going on? So, is this book your version of standing outside and screaming, do you people not know what's going on?
It's a very long, polite scream, yeah. This is the inherent trouble with writing books on disturbing topics, as I've done twice now, is like people will sometimes respond with like, I had a panic attack and started crying when I was reading your book, or like I threw up when I was fact checking your book, as my redoubtable fact checker did last time, because I had her reading like neo-Nazi chats, and I'm like, and then I'm like, this is bad for sales. Like, I'm like, no, it's
critical
very
to buy and read. Please, anybody who's listening to this, it will freak you out, but in the best way.
Well, it's more that I'm like, well, I'm freaked out and I'm upset along with you. Like, let's enter this journey together. Like, I'll be your Virgil through hell, but like, we're going to hell. I'm sorry. That is our destination, both according to like the Christians I write about, and then like, the subject matter of the book. You can imagine the angst and paranoia I deal with on a daily basis. I've learned that you have to not like approach the world like it's a potentially hostile garden of beasts. You have to think, but I've now had the opportunity to think sort of, okay, like people who I may be interacting with are informed by all sorts of backgrounds that are ideologically, but also kind of epistemically directly opposed to the way I was raised. Something that I think you inherently feel a little bit more when you're Jewish in America.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's one of the interesting things that I thought of and you start the book talking about this, that you approach this topic obviously as an outsider. You're Jewish and you're talking about Christians and Christian ideology and Christian nationalism. And I wonder if you thought that being an outsider to those kinds of communities, even though you spend a lot of time talking to people who come from Christian fundamentalist backgrounds and things, do you think that gives you more insight? Does it make it more challenging to take on a topic like this?
First of all, I think, as a Jew, I never grew up with the idea that like my culture was the default, or that I was the default setting for America, right? You even in like this Orthodox Jewish environment I was raised in, you still are aware of Christmas and that the country is celebrating and you're not taking part, right? So as with any hegemony, as with any like majority that you participate in, a lot of journalists who are Christian or culturally Christian or raised Christian or whatever, just like don't necessarily see the ubiquity of Christian ideals and images in the same way. So I think that in that sense, the outsider perspective was an advantage, in that I could be like, but okay, let's look at the full scope of what this hegemony means and what it's doing, and how it's invisible to so many people, like the people who are like, but what about the separation of church and state? And I'm kind of like, but what about it? If you live in Idaho, if you live in Iowa, if you live in Kansas, like you're functionally living in a Christian theocracy. I didn't make that up. That's just happening. the other piece is I didn't have a pocket Jesus to like upbraid these folks with or secretly think they're betraying Christianity with their outlandish theology or whatever. Like I didn't have an internal theological like no that I was constantly kind of either shoving aside or indulging. And I think that that was helpful.
I think we need to roll back and actually just get on a sort of a little bit above, like just actually talk about what the book is about and how you got to it. So if you want to tell us where the book came from for you and what it is essentially in this, whatever nutshell that you have developed over the time to describe it.
Thanks so much for reading. I'm sorry that it freaked you out on a flight. So the book is called Wild Faith: How the Christian Right is Taking Over America. And several people have sort of approached me and been like, you should change the tense of the verb in the subtitle. They've taken over. And like, no, 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 no. There's still some fight to be had. But basically, it's an overview of the Christian right as a political movement through the lens of a bunch of their different initiatives over the last 50 years. It's a cultural background, look at like moral panics and the judiciary capture and the anti-abortion movement. That's sort of the first half. And then the second half, I do a very deep dive into the sort of idealized family structure within this sort of Christian patriarchal environment. And then I talked to a lot of people who were affected by living within this heavily sort of mandated family structure and how it affected them and their lives. So we talk about homeschooling and we talk about child abuse and we talk about gender roles. I wouldn't say it's like a light read, but I would say it's a tight and urgent read. And
I'm propulsive. Like I really couldn't put it down.
And one of the things I think that we often grapple with when we address subjects like this is, how worried should you be if you think this is problematic? Well, one way you can look at it is, well, it's a big country. You can find pockets of people who have very disturbing beliefs in one way or another. Does it really matter? But one of the things that I kept thinking about reading the book is that the Christian nationalist movement is maybe on the cusp of having more power than they ever have before. If you look at the people whom Donald Trump is appointing to his new administration, a number of them are really hardcore Christian nationalists. Russell Vought, who is going to run the Office of Management and Budget and is kind of at the center of implementing Project 2025, he has been quite clear that what he wants is essentially a Christian takeover of the government. You have someone like Pete Hegseth, who not only has Crusader tattoos, people may have heard about that. As of this taping, we don't know if his nomination is going to survive or if he is going to run the Defense Department. But he is also, and this has gotten much less attention, there's a great article that Amanda Marcotte at Salon just wrote about this, that he is part of a church that has incredibly misogynistic views about women having to submit to their husbands. You have Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, who is
trades
not only a
porn
Christian
with his
nationalist.
son. What is that thing where
Well,
they
they monitor each other's porn.
monitor each other's porn intake?
But not only is he a Christian nationalist in many ways, he said not long ago that God was speaking to him on a nightly basis during the time before he became speaker. And ultimately, God told him that it was now his job to become Speaker of the House. So that's kind of the perspective that he's coming from. So you have all of these very powerful figures, even if Donald Trump himself is someone who, is clearly not a person of faith, but he is quite happy to give the Christian nationalists that he is allied with as much power as they could possibly want. So that's one of the reasons why this is a very, very apt moment to be talking about this. And yes, it is something to be very concerned about.
Yeah, I mean, this is not a fringe crew. This is not self-identified outsiders. These are the people that are going to be running the government in ways small and large. I'd also just add that like some of the figures on our Supreme Court come from, if not like the evangelical tradition, then the sort of Catholic reactionary tradition, which has been a part of the Christian right for a long time and are sort of fruits of this very deliberate project of judicial capture. I always think of knowledge as a form of self-defense. And if you're looking to take a very quick self-defense class in plunging yourself into our new era, this book does provide that, in that just like you'll be less gobsmacked by stuff. You'll be less surprised. Stuff is not going to come out of like left field and you're like, what, huh? How do people believe this? And you're like, no, I know. I read the book.
One of the things that I found so interesting in the first section, I have a ton of questions about both sections, but one of the things I want to talk about sort of in the first section of the book, you talk a lot about the satanic panic of the 80s and the McMartin preschool, all of those preschools, the people who spent decades in prison for satanic ritual child sexual abuse, who were completely innocent, who did nothing. And I had never thought to situate that satanic panic squarely in the religious right. Which you do really interestingly in the book, this idea of this kind of demons and Satanism. You know, I experienced that as a young law student and attorney as part of the feminist legal studies movement, where we were embracing this idea that children never lie about sexual abuse. Sexual abuse is ubiquitous. It's not a surprise to find out that there's all this sexual abuse, that you have to prepare children and believe all children, believe all women. And I wonder if you could talk about both that kind of demon satanic basis for that really terrifying period in our history, and the way that the echoes of that continue, and then also that strange nexus between the world that I was part of and that world.
Oh, yeah. I mean, one of the things that's so interesting about the Satanic Panic is that it may have originated with or sort of been given ground troops by the Christian right, you know, who are also engaged in like burning CDs, you know, of heavy metal and, you know, abjuring demonic influence on pop culture in all sorts of ways. I think there was also a big panic about Dungeons and Dragons at the same time. But you also had, you know, it wasn't just legal scholars. It was also this entire psychological and psychiatric establishment that was embracing this repressed memory theory that really gave rise to this rash of memoirs about, oh, I was abused by a satanic cult as a child, and feminists and the Justice Department, right? Janet Reno like prosecuted one of these cases and then went on to be Janet Reno, right? Attorney General of the US. So it's interesting that these things can be both about spiritual warfare and part of the Christian right, and then also in the way of moral panics, capture just like a broad swath of different segments of America for different reasons. The truth is, like, there has been, and continues to be a massive problem of unaddressed sexual abuse of women and children in this country.
So much of which occurs in the context of patriarchal religions like Catholicism and Christianity.
Sure, and in the home, right? And so that element is true, and I find the ways that the feminist movement was sort of gulled into going along with what was fundamentally a deeply reactionary project kind of complicated and sad. But a lot of the central figures, it's just like worth pointing out, of this moral panic that like had these very real repercussions of people going to jail for decades for these wild accusations of forcing kids to drink the blood of goats and flying through the air like witches, right? Because you're going with what a bunch of like heavily prompted 3-year-olds are going to say to try to please you, right? And things get more and more outlandish. Moral panics tend to have broad appeal and they come to you where you are. And I think the reason I started with the Satanic Panic was because, first of all, it sort of resurged in some senses in the guise of QAnon, where again you had this panic about devil-aligned evil adults abusing children and drinking their blood. Of course, there's echoes of the blood libel in there too. And also, generally, just the way the fear of the devil, the fear of his minions, it never went away. It just like maybe went underground for a while, was a little more within the Christian right, and then kind of now is just like a underpinning rhetorical force. So it's like moral panics never die, they just like hibernate.
One of the things that strikes me about this is that it's a really dark view of the world, that you know there are demons everywhere, that there are pedophiles lurking behind every door, that all the major events of the world are dictated by these extraordinarily sinister conspiracies. And I don't know what it's like to go through your life on this kind of constant edge of panic. But I guess on the other hand, it also lends life a kind of drama, right? That the world may seem mundane and you're just going to your boring job every day, but actually you can be part of this grand battle between good and evil that's playing out at your kid's school, in your very house, maybe between you and your kids. As you say, like, you can see those same kind of tendrils of that worldview all the way up to the present, even though, the Satanic Panic may have been back in the 80s, that with QAnon, it's the same themes that keep coming up over and over again.
And also, like, I observed this when I was writing about neo-Nazis too, that like the big advantage that this worldview confers is that it makes you a hero. When it comes to like neo-Nazi anti-Semitism, right? Like the gift that their view of like Jews has is that it gives them this infinitely cunning, infinitely powerful enemy to be punching up against. They're always the embattled little guy, no matter what their position in society, because they've invented sort of an infinitely powerful foe, and therefore their struggle is righteous. Similarly, when your opponent is the devil and his minions, and you are the righteous soldier of God, fighting, on the front lines, donning the whole armor of God, fighting, both through prayer and through banning, books from your kids' school library, it lends, like you said, drama. It makes you the hero in a supernatural narrative. And you can see this in a lot of like internal evangelical texts. So one of the things that I did for the book was read a lot of like these novels and parenting manuals and marriage manuals and influential books of prophecy. And these are written for evangelicals by evangelicals. So I find that these intra-community statements are often the best ways to determine like what a set of beliefs are, because they're not propagandizing and they're not trying to set their image to a broader world. But anyway, the sort of sensational novel in the late 80s and 90s, and every single ex-evangelical kid I talked to was like, yeah, I read this and read it at church and I read it at school and everyone read this. It's called This Present Darkness, and it has a sequel, like Piercing the Darkness. And it's about like a small American town, like Everytown, USA, is beset by a plague of demons, and the only person who can like truly fight back against it is this fundamentalist Christian minister. At the same time, like you see this overlay of the angels and demons that are fighting for the soul of this town. And it's so literal. It's like at one point the pastor's wife is like trying to get home, and there's this demonically possessed like biker who's going to attack her, and an angel and a demon fight a war to the death over her parking brake, and releasing her parking brake. And like the angel slays the demon but dies in the process, and the demon's flaming sword, and her parking brake is released, and she gets home in time to save her husband from temptation from a demonically possessed blonde slut. So there's just a lot going on there. But the point is, God and the devil are and the angels and the demons are intimately present in details as small as your parking brake.
How ubiquitous is this structure of beliefs? Like, I mean, one of the things that was so compelling is all of the people you talked to who had left. On the one hand, I read this stuff about how, like, the Americans are going to church far less frequently, but we're talking about these groups of evangelical Christians who believe these things that, we laugh when we hear them. That was one of the lines in the book that you talk about. Like, we laugh because it's absurd, but it's really not that funny.
Well, it's not that I'm against humor. It's more that I'm just like, you can and maybe should laugh, but like that doesn't change how sincerely these beliefs are.
And how ubiquitous are they, would you say? Like, is it that this group is small and it has outsized power, or is this group much larger than we imagine it to be?
So about 14 million Americans identify as white evangelical Christians. So that is a minority like punching far above its weight. It's like if you're looking at the religious minority that wants to run the government, it's not us. The other thing is that, as you note, like these beliefs do get disseminated in less formal ways, certainly get disseminated through the internet. And it's very hard to like really pinpoint like who is out there believing in spiritual warfare, how widespread is this belief. But if you look at public opinion polls on like Americans' belief in demons and angels, the numbers are consistently very, very high. But like belief in Satan is up there with like belief in God as sort of a cornerstone in American theology. We're a country that's like long held kind of the wilds of belief. We were founded by a bunch of religious zealots, and that sort of trickled down. Like the Pilgrims fled England after the Civil Wars because they were like too Puritan to be comfortable with sinful England in the Restoration. They didn't flee because they were persecuted. They fled because they wanted to persecute.
That is a really important message and a really interesting way to think about it.
Like they were like big fans of the guy who like banned Christmas in England, and they were like, "Oh, this is disgusting." Charles II wants to party. Yeah,
The original war on Christmas.
The original war on Christmas was all fought by Thomas Cromwell. So take it up with him. Listen, this stuff is like a little bit hard to define, but in terms of like how many Americans believe they're engaged in like they are like the righteous soldiers of God, engaged in a celestial battle against the devil, like the numbers in the millions. Extrapolating from there, how many people have adopted elements of this belief through like QAnon, through exposure to it within the GOP, like stickier question, but also where are the people who believe in spiritual warfare winding up? How many of them are in state legislatures? How many of them have these positions of disproportionate power? Like it is a powerful belief. It is a belief that impels you to act. And so much like the evangelical movement more broadly, and the Christian right more broadly, its numerical presence is belied by its influence and its power.
It was interesting, this connection you drew, and Paul, feel free to jump in. I have so many questions, but it was interesting when you were talking about abortion and this, obviously, this evangelical movement that started so recently, it turns out, the sort of moral panic about abortion. I found it really sort of chilling because when I was out there canvassing, as I was for Kamala Harris, including in Pennsylvania and wherever doing all my work, I thought when I would talk about abortion and I would talk about the women dying, that would be a compelling argument against laws criminalizing abortion and forced birth laws. And I realized reading your book that that's kind of the point, that if you're in a battle against Satan, those women who want to say have a DNC because they've had a miscarriage, who want to terminate a pregnancy that's doomed to disaster, who want to, rid their bodies of the decomposing corpse of a fetus, those women are the devil, right? They are on either Satan's minions or an expression of Satan himself. And so their death is sort of that. Not only aren't you concerned about it, I mean, am I overstating this? That it feels like for those people that their death is not just irrelevant, but maybe almost the point?
I would position it maybe a little bit differently, that like these women are not necessarily the devil, but that the desire to have an abortion or the expectation they'll have an abortion may be a demonic influence. But that, one of the things that's so pernicious about theocracy, to my mind, is that it's concerned with governing over souls and much less concerned with the fate of bodies. That can lead to some pretty dark shit very quickly. So when you talk about a woman dying of sepsis in a parking lot, like to you and I, that's a tragedy because this woman's body has been denied the care it needs, right? And therefore this woman will die, all of her. If you're looking at it from the perspective of like someone who's fully invested in the Christian right views of abortion and in spiritual warfare, this woman is a martyr. Her soul has been saved from the sin of abortion, and she can die a martyr. And this is a just and fitting end. And her soul will be counted among the saved.
And get its 40 virgins. I mean, it's the same theocracy, right? I mean, it is the same, this language, and you talk about dying a martyr. We're so easy to condemn that when we talk about Islam. We're so easy to think of it as completely foreign and crazy and horrific. But aren't we talking about the same thing, essentially? Isn't that language the same?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say Christian martyrology is like much more fetishistic and dense than like Islamic martyrology. I mean, all the saints and their various horrible fates, even though like Protestants don't have the same affection for the saints, many of the evangelical kids, former evangelical kids I talked to had been well acquainted with Fox's Book of Martyrs, which is this particularly Protestant inflected sort of view of people who died violently for the faith. The other thing is that like a lot of liberal commentators will be like, oh, these guys are like ISIS. This is a very American and very Christian like phenomenon. We don't need to be like, it's like those exotic Asians. It's like those evil Muslims. Like, no, it's like those Christians who've read the Bible to the people they were enslaving. It's like those Christians who have for centuries used their faith as a cudgel. Like you don't need the analogy here. It's like been here. It's always been here. And the difference now is that it's like right at the center of power. I will say that like the martyrdom in question is like a quieter martyrdom, right? It's not the 40 virgins martyrdom. It's the martyrdom of her body may have suffered, but her soul is pure. And it's violently imposed by the state.
Well, can we talk a bit about violence? And maybe this will be a bridge to eventually getting to the child rearing topic, which I'm sure we have a lot of questions about. This, I think, it's interesting in that it has both the religious and secular aspects to it. Because if you look at the campaign that Donald Trump just ran, even more so than his previous campaigns, it was really saturated in violent rhetoric and kind of luxuriating in it and celebrating it. This is one of the, I think, the real connections between Trumpism and fascism. Not just that he talks about how I'd like to see protesters punched in the face and things, and fantasizes about himself committing acts of violence. And you saw how at his convention, there were people like Hulk Hogan and Dana White, who owns UFC, the Mixed Martial Arts League. And Trump, I think multiple times, went to UFC fights and really just tried to kind of immerse himself in that violent culture. I could talk all about my feelings about what that represents, but there's no question that in trying to appeal largely to young men, but I think to a lot of men of all ages, maybe, he was really saying that, like, if you like this kind of violent culture, and that's what UFC is, it's about the thrill that people get, the adrenaline charge that they get from watching two men attempt to beat each other to death, that he's the guy for you because he likes that stuff too. And as you say in the book, there was one quote that jumped out to me. You're talking about the books that you read about Christian parenting and their views on corporal punishment. And you say that they describe it as an uncompromising struggle for dominance with physical violence as a principal tool. That this is something that is not just outside, violence is in your house, and it is something that is worthwhile and even godly.
Just to go back to the first half of the question, the idea of violence as entertainment, the term in wrestling is kayfabe. Kayfabe is like the fake fight narrative where it's like you've got the heel and you've got the hero and it's this sort of pageantry of violence, but it's all like set out. We know who's gonna win, or like not we, but like the people running the show know who's gonna win. Kayfabe is like a prefabricated or false sort of narrative along a violent narrative along dramatic lines. And Abraham Josephine Reisman, who's a brilliant journalist, wrote a whole book on neo kayfabe in politics, and just want to plug that because it's brilliant and she's brilliant. I think that with Trumpian fantasies of violence, it wasn't so much the I love the UFC that was like, but I mean that is symptomatic, right? And it's very masculine, and it's this machismo. Yeah, I'm literally gonna have Hulk Hogan like strip off his shirt at the RNC, but also his fantasies are about like executing drug dealers, deporting.
And we hear that execution, executing political enemies, killing political enemies all the time.
It's that targeting, executing, deporting, hurting, harming, like this. Like, I am gonna hurt people for you. And it's a certain kind of iconoclasm. And you can see how Americans who are like desperate and sad and trapped, like may, turn towards someone they perceive as an iconoclast, even though he's the race to line his own pockets and like that of the various billionaires that he's advised by is like maybe is obscene in its own right. But the status quo is basically fine, is like not a great pitch necessarily.
Yeah, we've talked about that, about how that our message, like, "No, no, no, you're not, there's no real inflation," and take that to every sort of issue does not make any sense and was not a winning argument. I have the, we're talking about this violence. One of the things that your book did so well in the chapter about punishing of children, which is so the kind of fetishistic, ubiquitous, elaborately constructed and punishment apparatus for hurting children, use this kind of stick in this kind of way, entire books devoted to it. What I kept thinking when I was reading that, and again, this echoes of it you hear with, when you just said like Hulk Hogan taking off his shirt, it feels like it's wrapped up so completely in sex and sexual abuse. And I wonder if you found that to be the case, that this punishment of children, this domination over the wife, like we're seeing with like trad wives that we all have been hearing about, like, Ballerina, whatever her name is, if that kind of sexual domination, am I just reading too much into it when I think about that as having some kind of real thread of weird sexual stuff? Or do you think that's really part of it?
Absolutely. I mean, you're talking about like violent dominion over bodies, and again in this very ritualistic way. But like, let me give you like a little preface, like backgrounder on like what this movement is about that I'm talking about. Like, obviously people have hit kids for a very long time. What I looked at was the sort of formalization of that, of corporal punishment, into like a political and social movement. And that happened in the 70s and 80s. James Dobson, Yamach Shamo, wrote this book, Dare to Discipline. He was the founder of Focus on the Family, and indeed he did, in like the worst possible ways, this very big ministry. Dare to Discipline. It was like, oh, these kids. Basically, the Christian right was reacting to youth-led protest movements in the 60s and 70s, that it was students who were at the forefront. It was young people who were at the forefront of the, gay rights and civil rights and feminist movements, and saying like, we've got to stand athwart these movements, these changes. And the way we can do that is to make sure that, youths are not so unruly going forward. Permissive parenting of the 50s was just way too lax. We've got to go back to biblical parenting, in Dare to Discipline and in The Strong-Willed Child. And to be clear, the strong-willed child is a bad thing. You want to conquer that strong will. And it's many, 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 many imitators, many of which I read. I have God the Rod on Your Child's Bod on my shelf. And every time I pass it, I feel like a monster. The idea basically is it's very Calvinist. Man is inherently sinful from the moment we're born. And the way to conquer that nature is to enforce absolute obedience through physical violence. And it's this sort of cradle to adolescence program of physical domination in order to enforce instant and joyful obedience and submission from your kids. And this is not just convenient or whatever, like to have obedient kids. It also is saving their souls. For whatever reason, they've adopted Proverbs as like the most important book in the Bible about, this stuff, even though like, I think by any measure, Proverbs is a pretty minor entry in the canon, but like it is the one that deals with child rearing, and particularly there's a couple of, it's like, if you do not use the rod on your child to correct your child, he shall surely die. And then this becomes the cornerstone of a parenting philosophy that tells parents, like, if you don't hit your kid, you're condemning them to hell forever.
And why are you hitting your kid when they're naked? Why is that part of it? Why is beating them on their bare behind part of this? Because like, you can imagine that you could skip the whole take their clothes off piece and still comply with these, whatever it says in Proverbs. Why are they so devoted to stripping their children?
As God the Rod and the child's and your child's bod says, God gave us this perfect area to utilize on our child's body. It's fatty, and it's just above the back, and it's perfect. I mean, and then you combine that with this like culture of modesty and chastity, especially on girls, where like your body is a site of shame and you're hitting these girls on their bare behinds until they're even like 12, 13, 14, long past the moment they've been told in every arena of their lives to be acutely aware of their bodies. And like many of these girls that I talk to, these former, evangelical kids, experience that as a sexual violation. And Gillian Keenan, who wrote a book about her life as a spanking fetishist, did address this also. She's like, look, like this is an erogenous zone. This is right next to the genitals. And if even 1% of children that we like spank in this area experience this as a sexual violation, we're sexually violating too many kids. And of course, my interlocutors were self-selecting. They were people who like responded when I put out a call of like, hey, were you raised in like a James Dobson household? Were you raised with physical abuse? How did it impact you? Right. So that's self-selecting. But when you're talking to 150 people and like, if you ask like, hey, did this ever feel violating in like a sexual way? And the responses are just like overwhelming. Like, of course, like no one touched my body. My body like was viewed as like this temple of temptation and shame and lust. And then to have it stripped bare and violated, touched in these ways was very confusing and overwhelming. And like even from a younger age, before puberty, like kids do have developing sexualities in these books. And I think some of the hardest stuff to read of all the material that I read for this book were these parenting manuals. But like a lot of them describe this ritual that you do where it's like first you take the child into a bedroom or a bathroom or whatever, like a private space. You spank them this requisite number of spanks. If they're crying too hard and don't seem like if they're crying too hard and that feels defiant, like spank them again until they stop crying so much. And then when they seem appropriately contrite, you have this mini ceremony of forgiveness where you hug them and you tell them you love them and forgive them. And so you're immediately following up this violent touch with gentle touch. You're immediately following anger and pain with love. And it's like, this is just a recipe to cross wires here.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been lots and lots and lots and lots of studies that show that people who are the recipients of physical abuse and corporal punishment in childhood, not necessarily like differentiated by like punishment and anger versus like spanking, that's broadly viewed as okay, they're more likely to be involved in abusive relationships, either as the abuser or the abused. And then on a broader social level, part of the question I think this answers is like, why do so many Americans seem blasé or even excited about accepting autocratic authority? And I think an overlooked cause is this generations long project of bringing back authoritarianism into the home. So if you are raised in this way, there's a couple things that are happening. First of all, you're accustomed to brutality and violence. It's part of your everyday existence. You are taught that absolute obedience to authority, first man's, then God's, whatever. But absolute joyful, instantaneous obedience is the highest ideal that you can live up to. And you're also implicitly taught to empathize with the aggressor at all times, right? As kids, we worship our parents, we admire our parents, we view their decision to spank us as a horrible fault in ourselves, right? So part of the rhetoric you see from like figures like Tucker Carlson is like, America needs a spanking and daddy's gonna come home. And this is about Trump, that this country really needs to be spanked into shape. And so that's like the outer edge of it. But there were studies also about like child rearing in like fin de siècle Germany, and it had a very similar pedagogy. And I was reading these like German pedagogical texts and these evangelical manuals side by side. I'm like, oh boy, these like are very, very, very similar. That it's like, this is how much you hit your kid. This is what you use. You do not brook any disobedience. You immediately engage in physical upbraiding, right? And the psychologist Alice Miller, who's a Holocaust survivor, She wrote The Drama of the Gifted Child, but she also wrote For Your Own Good, which is about authoritarian parenting. And she's like, this is how you make a torturer, right?
Wow.
This is how you make a torturer. And you teach someone from before they can walk, before they can talk, that the consequences of disobedience are to be hurt, to be shamed, and you teach someone to be accustomed to violence and brutality on an everyday basis, and you teach someone to be absolutely obedient and even loving towards a violent authority. And so the reason why I spend so long on this stuff in a book like about the Christian right more broadly, first of all, I think it's an undertold story.
Mm-hmm.
But second of all, I think it goes a very long way towards explaining the authoritarian streak in our politics and why so many Americans seem eager to, from a certain perspective, give up their free will and their choices.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're from a very, very, very young age, in some cases, like from infancy, from before you can walk, before you can talk, as you know, when you're crawling, you're being hit, right? Like choice becomes fraught with peril. Choice becomes something that you don't necessarily desire because it can lead you like to be punished, right?
And it's interesting when I see the advocates of corporal punishment talk about it to a larger audience, when there's a debate, say, over whether or not a state should finally say that teachers can't hit kids, they always describe it as something that is very orderly and calm and not particularly all that unpleasant for the kids, and something that is very infrequent. But if you look at these texts that you read so many of, James Dobson and all of these others, they're not describing it as something infrequent. They're describing it as something that is given to children for even the most minor infractions, like rolling your eyes at something your parents said. And it is something that will happen in many cases to many people on a daily basis, that they are being met with physical violence, and that they're being shown that this is how adults solve problems, that you inflict violence on somebody who did something you don't like. And, I'm going to read just a sentence that you wrote because it really stuck out to me. You said the texts are filled with palpable disgust, even rage toward children. One of the things that made me think of, I just recently read Shalom Auslander's new book, Feh, where he talks about how in his ultra-Orthodox upbringing, the immediate message he got even as a child was that God finds human beings utterly disgusting and has nothing but contempt for us. And all of the scriptures are just filled with him telling us how awful we are and undeserving we are. And that it's kind of resonated with me. But there is this real kind of thing you see in Dobson and these other texts, that the way to treat your children is that they are just awful, and you have to constantly be abusing them if you're going to turn them into something that will be acceptable in society. Otherwise, they will just be completely out of control, and only through violence can you tame their kind of repulsive animal spirit.
That man's nature is sinful, and only through this kind of literally heavy-handed intervention can we possibly mold these feral, evil children into something approaching, godly and pious people. And it's dark. It's also why, like, the unborn being in potentia and therefore not fully invested with their sin nature are, so appealing. Whereas even like a baby is like, you read like some of the worst of these manuals are just like, yeah, baby's crying because it's selfish. A baby is crying because it's expressing its inherently sinful nature. I'm like, it's a fucking baby. Like, what are you talking about? But yeah, sure, okay. We all have different views of human nature. Did Shalom Auslander grow up ultra orthodox or
Yeah.
modern? Okay.
Ultra.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
that's
think-
a
Yeah. I mean, I
that's a
think the
world
best
that's
way
like,
to explain Shalom's relationship with God is that he believes in him, but he thinks he's a fucking nightmare.
yeah, well, fair enough. I will say, just like, what's interesting in these models where discipline, obedience, submission are sort of all the watchwords. And like, yes, you are right, there's a sexual penumbra to all of these things, right? The role of the wife, like the role of the patriarch, is God's emissary into the household, and The role of the wife is submissive co-enforcer. The role of the children is property, to be like abused. It's uncomplicated and horrifying, and it's also just like, this is the family structure that not only do these folks embrace wholeheartedly, but it's also the one they want like as the only family structure in the US. And so thinking about like how do you counter this sort of movement that's so organized in what it wants in favor of essentially the cacophony of free will? How do you say like, we want to fight for the ability to have any kind of family model you want, and to raise kids with kindness, or all the different ways you can raise kids? We want to fight for like people to have different faiths or none at all, and people to be weird about sex, but like not theocratically weird about sex. Like, we want people to have weird fun sex, and we want people to explore and experiment, right? So how do you fight for free will with the same zealotry or the same enthusiasm that zealots and autocrats who have a very unified vision are fighting for? Like, this is the challenge. The sort of framing image of the book is like music, where I talk about, for people who are not attuned to like just like noticing Christian hegemony, it's like becomes like this muzak that like you falls under your attention, you just like ignore it, it's part of daily life. But if if you're not part of it, like you have the sixth sense where you're always hyper aware of that music and it changing into the tenor of like a war march, right? My metaphor for like how we fight back is also a musical one, where I think about counter zeal, I think about fighting back, and my vision is like a giant, joyous, raucous band of people who are all playing in different tempos and all playing different beats, and we're playing Zydeco, and we're playing John Philip Sousa, and we're playing electronica or whatever, but we're on the march, and we're making our big, loud, strange music, and we're drowning out the hymns of onward Christian soldier. The idea of just summoning up a counter zeal and a joyous rebellion against a movement that wants to enforce joyless conformity.
That is a beautiful, beautiful call to action, I think, and the best place we can end. So I want to tell everybody that if you want to join that band, please buy Wild Faith by Talia Lavin. It'll give you the instrument you need.
Yeah, and if you enjoyed the dulcet sounds of my voice, I did narrate the audiobook. I also have a newsletter, The Sword and the Sandwich, where I write about politics, but I also every Friday write about a different sandwich from Wikipedia's list of notable sandwiches. And this year's essay on grilled cheese wound up in Best American Food and Travel Writing.
Oh,
so
wonderful.
you gotta have both. You gotta have the sword and the sandwich. Otherwise you'll go nuts. Or even more nuts than I already am. But we have to invite joy into our lives as a way of sustaining us through the struggle. So thank you so much to the Waldmans.
Talia, we really appreciate
for having
it.
me on. All right.
Thank you, Talia. This was terrific. Boundary Issues is produced and edited by Paul Waldman. Our music is by Zeke Shabon. If you'd like to get in touch, you can email us at waldmanpodcast@gmail.com. See you next time.